Welcome back to another deep dive.
Yeah.
This is our fourth one into the events surrounding the Nanking Massacre.
Mm-hmm.
This time we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit.
Right.
We're going to look at the trials of Japanese war criminals.
Interesting.
Which is something that I think is really important to understand, how justice was pursued or not.
Right.
In the aftermath.
Yeah.
And we've got some really fascinating sources for this.
Oh, cool.
We've got court testimonies. We've got personal diaries.
Wow.
We even have some official reports.
That's a really interesting mix.
Yeah. So what jumps out at you as we start looking through this material?
Well, what's really interesting to me is how different all these types of sources are.
Yeah.
You've got the court testimonies, which are really raw and emotional.
Right.
And then you have something like Matsuyowan's diary,
Right.
which gives us like a glimpse into the mindset of a high-ranking Japanese official.
Oh, wow.
At the time. And then you've got like the official documents, which give us the legal framework.
Okay.
So it's almost like you're trying to piece together a puzzle, but all the pieces are different shapes and sizes.
It's like we're getting the human element.
Yes.
And then we're also getting like the justifications and the legal machinery.
Exactly.
All at the same time.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that machinery for a second.
Okay.
What kind of trials were actually set up to deal with the Nanking Massacre specifically?
Right.
And I know a lot of people are familiar with the Tokyo trials, but
Mm-hmm.
was there something that was more focused on Nanking itself?
Yeah, you're right. The Tokyo trials were happening on a larger scale, but there was also the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal,
Okay.
which was active from 1946 to 1947.
Okay.
And it was specifically focused on the crimes that happened in Nanking.
Got it.
And they actually tried over 100 suspects.
Over 100. Wow. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
What kind of sentences did they end up handing down?
Well, the sentences actually varied quite a bit. 6 individuals received the death penalty. 10 were given life sentences and 12 got fixed-term imprisonments.
Okay.
But I think even just the sheer number of suspects that they had to deal with,
Right.
it kind of tells you how widespread the atrocities were.
Yeah.
And how many people were potentially involved.
It really shows the scale of it. Now let's zoom in on one specific trial that seems to have gotten a lot of attention, and that's the trial of Tani Hisao.
Right.
Why was he such a key figure?
Well, Tani was a lieutenant general in the Japanese Imperial Army.
Okay.
And he was a central figure in the capture of Nanking.
Okay.
And his trial was really important because it tackled the issue of command responsibility.
Oh.
So
yeah.
could a high-ranking official like him be held accountable for the actions of his troops?
That's a big question.
It is a huge question.
It's huge implications, not just for this trial,
Yeah.
but for international law in general.
Right.
And what I've read about Tani's defense strategy, it was interesting.
Yes.
It seems like he was trying to distance himself from any personal blame.
Absolutely. And his defense actually involved several tactics.
Okay.
So he tried to shift blame to other units, claiming they were the ones responsible for the worst atrocities.
Oh, so he wasn't denying that atrocities happened.
Right.
He was just saying it wasn't him.
He was trying to point the finger somewhere else.
Okay.
He also argued that the chaos of war made it impossible to control every soldier's actions.
Okay, so the fog of war.
Exactly. The fog of war. It was like, I can't be held responsible for everything that happened in that chaos.
So he's acknowledging that things happened,
Right.
but he's saying he can't be held responsible for it.
It's not my fault.
So where does that leave us in terms of international law?
Right.
Was this a clear case of victor's justice, as some claim, or a genuine attempt to hold people accountable?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, you could say that, the victors in any war have the power.
Right.
And they might use trials to punish their enemies. But on the other hand, there's also this moral obligation to hold people accountable for war crimes.
Right.
No matter what side they were on.
Regardless of who won or lost.
Exactly.
So it's a very tricky balance to find.
It is.
Do you think Tani's trial and the Nanjing trials in general found that balance? Or were there limitations and controversies that kept them from achieving true justice?
Well, that's a great question, and it actually leads us into some of the challenges that these tribunals had to face.
Right.
There were some pretty significant obstacles,
Okay.
like jurisdictional issues, gathering evidence.
Okay.
It was complicated. And these challenges definitely impacted the pursuit of justice in Nanking.
Okay, let's dig into those a little bit. What were some of the biggest hurdles that the tribunals had to deal with?
Okay, well, one of the most significant limitations was jurisdiction.
Okay.
The Nanjing Tribunal was really focused on lower-ranking officials.
Okay.
Many higher-ranking Japanese figures, those who were potentially most culpable, were never even put on trial.
So it's like trying to solve a crime, but you don't have access to all the suspects.
Exactly. And that was a huge problem.
It seems kind of counterintuitive that they would leave out those higher-ranking people.
I know, right?
The ones who may have given the orders.
It does seem strange.
Why was that?
Well, there are a few reasons. First, there were questions about who even had the authority to prosecute these high-ranking officials.
Okay.
Second, extradition was a huge logistical and political hurdle.
Oh, yeah.
Getting those people to China to face trial,
Right.
not an easy thing to do.
So jurisdiction and extradition were two big obstacles.
Yeah.
What other challenges made it hard to achieve justice?
Well, imagine trying to gather evidence in a place that's been ravaged by war.
Right.
Many documents had been destroyed.
Oh, wow.
It was really difficult to prove a clear chain of command or to show direct orders for specific atrocities.
Right, because a lot of that paper trail might be gone.
Exactly. And because of that lack of documentation, personal accounts and testimonies became really important.
I was going to say, that's got to be where it gets really interesting for our listeners.
Right.
The lack of documents means that those stories, those firsthand accounts of what happened, become even more crucial to the case.
Yeah, they really had to rely on people's memories and their experiences.
Which are powerful.
Oh, incredibly powerful.
But also introduce another layer of complexity.
They do, and some people argued that those personal accounts couldn't always be trusted.
Okay.
You know, memories can be influenced by trauma, by the passage of time.
Right.
Could they really provide the proof needed in a court of law?
So you have these really powerful stories.
Yeah.
From people who experienced this horrible event firsthand.
Right.
But then you also have this question of, can those stories hold up in a court?
Exactly. It was a real dilemma.
Yeah, because in court, you need evidence.
You need proof.
Yeah.
It was a tough balance to strike.
So it sounds like getting justice after the Nanking Massacre was far from straightforward.
It really wasn't.
You've got these limitations with jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the challenges with evidence.
Yes.
You've got the difficulties of using personal accounts in court.
Right.
It kind of sounds like incomplete justice.
Unfortunately, yes. Many of the people who committed these crimes were never even brought to trial.
It's a sobering thought.
Mm-hmm.
Even when you have these processes in place, there are limitations. But I do want to point out that there was some remarkable public involvement in these trials.
Oh, absolutely.
Particularly in Nanjing itself.
Yeah.
So let's look at how the citizens of Nanking took an active role in trying to get justice for these crimes.
So the Nanjing Temporary Municipal Assembly, the NTMA, they were really important.
Okay.
They actually created a whole commission dedicated to this.
Oh, wow.
The Rape of Nanking Enemy Crimes Investigation Commission.
That's a mouthful.
It is. But their goal was to collect evidence and testimonies.
Wow. So these are citizens actively trying to help bring these criminals to justice. What motivated them to do this?
Well, I think there are a few things. Of course, there was a desire for justice, to see the perpetrators punished.
Right.
But there was also this deep sense of duty.
Okay.
They knew that their involvement could shape how people remembered the massacre.
Right.
That it could help ensure that the truth wasn't forgotten.
So it was bigger than just revenge.
Yes, much bigger. They wanted to make sure that what happened in Nanking was acknowledged and remembered.
So did this involvement actually have an impact on the trials?
Oh, it did. In a lot of ways, actually. The evidence gathered by the commission, especially those eyewitness testimonies, really helped the prosecution.
Okay.
And it also raised public awareness and support for the trials.
Gotcha.
It made it harder for people to ignore what had happened.
So it wasn't just the courts pushing for justice.
Nope.
It was the people themselves.
Exactly. The people of Nanjing were demanding accountability.
That's powerful. Now we have to talk about Matsui Oren's diary.
Ah, yes.
It's a controversial document.
It is.
But it offers a very unique perspective
Definitely.
on the mindset of a high-ranking Japanese official during the Nanking Massacre.
It really does. It's a fascinating read, but it's also very disturbing.
So tell us a little bit more about it. What makes it so unique?
Well, Matsuzi's diary is captivating because it's a mix of acknowledging the atrocities
Okay.
and then denying responsibility.
So he's admitting that bad things happened,
Yeah.
but then saying, but it wasn't me.
Pretty much. And remember, he was the commander of the Japanese Central China Area Army during the massacre.
Oh, wow. He was in charge.
He was. So his perspective is really important, even if it's problematic.
Okay, so he was the top military leader, but he's trying to shift the blame. What exactly was he admitting to?
In his diary entries, he talks about the atrocities committed by troops under his command.
Okay.
He describes instances of rape, looting, murder.
Oh, wow.
But then he tries to downplay his own role in all of it.
So he's saying these things happened, but it wasn't his fault. How does he justify that, especially as the commander?
Well, his justifications are similar to what we saw with Tani Hisao.
Okay.
He blames lower-ranking soldiers for acting out of control.
So a lack of discipline.
Right. He also blames the fog of war,
Okay.
saying that these atrocities were just an unavoidable consequence of the conflict. It's classic deflecting.
So it's that same tactic, the idea that high-ranking officials can't be held responsible for every single thing their soldiers do.
Exactly. But it's still disturbing, especially coming from the commander.
Right, because ultimately he was in charge. So his diary really raises this question of, where does the responsibility lie?
It does, and that's why historians find it so compelling. We get to see how someone directly involved in the events tries to rationalize what happened.
It's like a window into his thinking at the time.
Exactly. It's not a neutral account, it's his perspective, but it's still incredibly valuable.
But how can we be sure the diary is authentic?
That's a good question. There's always the possibility of fabrication or manipulation.
Right, especially with a document like this.
Absolutely. The authenticity has been debated. Some people think it might be fake.
Really?
Or that it's been heavily edited. However, many historians believe it's genuine.
Okay.
But it's important to read it with a critical eye.
Right.
We need to consider why Matsui wrote what he did, his potential biases.
So it's not just taking it at face value.
No, not at all. You have to remember he had a vested interest in shaping how history remembers him.
Okay, so it's not a neutral, objective source?
No, it's not. It's a document written by someone who wants to control his narrative.
That's a good reminder that we need to be careful when looking at historical sources.
We do. It's not just about what's being said, it's about who's saying it and why.
Now let's zoom out for a moment.
Okay.
And consider the international context. The Nanking trials weren't happening in a vacuum.
Right.
They were part of a much larger effort to hold Japan accountable for its actions during World War II.
Exactly.
What was going on that global stage?
Well, you're right. The Nanking trials were just one part of the picture. The Tokyo trials, which were happening at the same time, were focused on the bigger picture.
Okay.
They were going after Class A war criminals.
Okay.
And they established some really important precedents for defining and prosecuting crimes against peace and crimes against humanity.
Oh, okay.
And those definitions actually influenced trials in China and other places.
So those legal concepts that were developed in Tokyo were then used in more specific cases like the ones in Nanking.
Yes, exactly. There was this effort to create a more unified approach to dealing with war crimes internationally.
Okay, so a global standard.
Yeah, because before World War II, there wasn't really a clear system for prosecuting these kinds of atrocities on an international level.
So these trials were kind of groundbreaking in a way.
They were a turning point, despite all their flaws.
It seems like a huge step towards creating a world where individuals can be held accountable for these terrible crimes.
It was a step in the right direction, a message that actions have consequences, no matter what your nationality or rank.
That idea of the universal standard for justice is really powerful, especially when we're talking about something as horrific as the Nanking Massacre.
It is, and it underscores why it's so important to remember these events.
Right,
we have to
yes.
learn from the past so we can prevent these things from happening again.
It's clear that the trials of Japanese war criminals, while imperfect, played a key role in how we think about justice on a global scale.
Absolutely.
But we've only scratched the surface.
We have.
There's so many more fascinating details and insights waiting for us in these sources.
There are. For me, it's the way individual stories intersect with the larger historical narrative that's really fascinating.
Right.
We saw how those personal testimonies, like the ones collected by that commission in Nanjing, actually shaped the trials.
Yeah.
And how we remember these events,
Right.
which shows the power of individual voices
Yeah.
to challenge official narratives and demand justice.
That's a really important point, and something that stuck with me throughout this whole deep dive. These weren't just abstract legal battles.
No.
They were deeply personal for so many people who were seeking justice and recognition for incredible suffering.
They were. And that's something we should never forget. It makes you think about all those stories that we don't have.
Right?
The ones that were lost or never recorded.
Yeah.
Those voices are still part of this history, even if we don't hear them.
It is a sobering thought.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that we only get a small piece of the whole picture.
We do. But even with what we have, it's clear that these trials were a significant moment in the pursuit of international justice.
They were.
Despite all the challenges and the controversies.
Yeah.
They set a precedent for holding people accountable.
Right.
For wartime atrocities.
That's important.
It is. And that legacy continues today.
Oh, interesting.
Think about the modern war crimes tribunals, the ones we see in places like Rwanda and Yugoslavia.
Right.
The echoes of those early trials are still felt.
It's amazing to think how events from decades ago are still shaping our world today.
They are. And that's why it's so important to keep learning about them.
Right.
To keep questioning and exploring.
Yeah.
We can't just let these events fade into the past.
Because they're lessons to be learned.
Exactly. Lessons for the present and for the future.
So for our listener, what would you say are the biggest takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, I think one of the key takeaways is just how complex it is to pursue justice.
Yeah.
After atrocities like this.
Right.
It's not a simple thing.
Right.
We've seen the problems with jurisdiction, the difficulty of gathering evidence,
Right.
the ethical dilemmas of using personal stories in a legal setting.
It highlights the challenges of international justice.
It does.
There's no easy solution.
No.
No magic wand to wave and make everything right.
But despite all of that, we still saw these incredible efforts to hold people responsible.
We did. Even in the middle of all that chaos and destruction.
And those efforts were driven by a lot of things. International pressure, the precedent set by the Tokyo trials, and the hard work of so many people who wanted to see justice done.
And we can't forget the role of the public.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in Nanjing.
They weren't just sitting back and watching.
Yeah.
They were active participants.
They were. That commission they set up.
Right.
The Rape of Nanking Enemy Crimes Investigation Commission.
Right.
It's a testament to the power of people coming together.
They understood the importance of documenting what happened.
They did.
Of making sure their voices were heard.
And their efforts made a difference.
They did.
There's no doubt about that.
It's inspiring to see how everyday people can have such a powerful impact.
It is. They remind us that justice often starts from the ground up.
It's about people demanding accountability.
And their work in gathering those testimonies, preserving those stories, it's invaluable.
It helps us understand the Nanking Massacre today.
It does. Now, speaking of those personal accounts, we talked a lot about Matsuri One's diary.
We did.
It gave us a unique perspective.
It did.
But it also raised some really difficult questions.
It did. It was fascinating.
It was.
But it also left me with a lot to think about.
Matsui's diary is a great example of how even personal documents can be really revealing.
Yeah.
But they also need to be looked at carefully.
Right, because they're not always objective.
Exactly. And the way he tried to acknowledge the atrocities but then distance himself from them, it shows how complex it can be to determine individual responsibility during wartime.
Especially for someone in a leadership position.
Especially for a leader.
And it makes you think about why he wrote what he did.
Right. What was his purpose?
Was he trying to be introspective? Or was he trying to control how history would see him?
It's a question historians are still debating.
And it reminds us that we always need to think critically about historical sources.
We do. We have to consider the context, the author's biases, who they were writing for.
It's rarely black and white.
It's not. History is full of shades of gray.
With conflicting narratives and agendas.
And it's always a challenge to figure out what's really true.
Which is what makes studying history so fascinating.
It is. It's a constant process of discovery and reinterpretation.
And questioning.
Always questioning. We're always trying to understand ourselves and the world better.
I think that's a great point to end on for our listeners.
I agree.
We've explored these trials, the good and the bad, and how they've influenced our ideas about justice.
And how they continue to influence us today.
But as we've said before, this is just the beginning.
It is.
There's so much more to learn and discover.
There is. And every new piece of information adds to our understanding of this complex and challenging period. It really does make you think.
Yeah, it's like we've covered so much, but like you said, it's just the tip of the iceberg, really.
It is.
What do you think is like the biggest takeaway from all of this?
For me, it's the legacy.
Oh,
like these trials were a huge turning point. in how we think about international law.
Okay.
And holding people accountable for these kinds of crimes.
Right, like war crimes.
Crimes against peace, crimes against humanity.
Right.
These concepts came out of the Tokyo trials.
Yeah.
And they're still shaping how we deal with atrocities.
Even today.
Even today.
I hope that's something that our listeners really grasp. Like, it's easy to think about these events as just something that happened in the past.
Right.
But they're not.
They're not.
Like, they're still relevant.
Absolutely.
Because they set precedents.
They did.
That we're still following today.
They did.
In a lot of ways.
In a lot of ways.
And we've talked about how these trials had problems.
Oh, yeah.
They were imperfect.
They were.
There were controversies. And it didn't always feel like justice was fully served.
No, it didn't.
But I think it's important to recognize that they did lay the groundwork.
They did.
For future efforts.
Absolutely.
To hold people accountable.
They set the stage.
Yeah.
For a more just world.
Yeah. Even if we're not quite there yet.
We're not there yet.
But it's a process.
It is.
And I think for our listener, it's important to understand that this fight for justice, it's ongoing.
It is.
It didn't end with these trials.
No.
It started with them.
It did.
And it's something that we have to keep working towards.
Absolutely.
Every single day.
Every day.
And it's a global effort.
It is. It really is.
And I think the fact that people in Nanjing were so involved in these trials is really inspiring.
It is.
They didn't just sit back and wait for someone else to take care of it.
They didn't.
They took action.
They took action.
They formed that commission.
They did.
And they made a difference.
Absolutely.
It really shows that everyday people have the power to make a difference.
They do. They really do.
When it comes to holding people accountable for their actions.
It starts with individuals.
Yeah. And we talked about Matsuya Wana's diary.
Yes.
It was so fascinating.
It was.
But it also raised a lot of difficult questions.
It did.
Like, what was he really trying to say?
Right.
Was he being sincere?
Right. Was it genuine remorse?
Yeah. Or was it just self-preservation?
Or was he trying to protect his legacy?
Yeah.
Those are questions we're still asking today.
And it shows just how complex history can be.
It is complex.
It's not always clear-cut.
No, it's not.
There are always multiple perspectives.
There are.
And hidden agendas.
And we have to be careful.
Yeah.
About how we interpret those sources.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the specifics of Tani Hisao's defense to the impact these trials had on international law.
It's a big topic.
It is a big topic.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
There's so much more to explore.
Yeah. So to our listeners, I encourage you to keep learning.
Keep digging.
Keep asking questions.
Keep diving deep.
Keep diving deep.